Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the International Broadcasting Trust. I'm Mark Galloway, the director of the Trust. Climate change is a subject that we've been interested in for a number of years. I want to say a few words because we're actually going to be publishing a report in November, a year after Paris, where we look at how television has covered climate change and whether the tone or content has changed and what the challenges and opportunities are. And we'll be holding a round table with industry leaders. So if you have any stories or experience that you'd like to contribute, the author of the report is here in the room, Professor Joe Smith from the Open University. Joe, can you just identify yourself? Do come and have a word with Joe afterwards. And Helen, who's sitting next to him, is working on this. And we're very keen to gather testimony from producers. We're also working on this project with the JJ Charitable Trust, which is setting up a development fund to try and encourage producers who have climate change-related ideas. So if you want to pitch a project, feel free afterwards to talk to Jill and Sian from the Trust, if you identify yourselves. But I'm going to hand over to Tom now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, and thank you all for coming. For those of you that don't know, my name is Tom Heap. I present on a number of environment-related shows on the BBC, Countryfile on BBC One, Costing the Earth on Radio 4, which is pretty much the only national environment series, broadcast environment series in this country, as well as the occasional Panorama. And the idea of today's session is really to talk about the challenges and opportunities and occasional anguishes, or perhaps frequent anguishes, of pitching an idea related to climate change, and with the help of our panel and also your experience to really get into some of the nitty-gritty of the opportunities and problems that presents. Just by way of introduction, just a very small anecdote. Toward the end of the last series of the series before, of Costing the Earth, we were doing a program in relation to Paris, and we decided we'd try and just get some big interviewees, and amongst others, we got an interview with James Cameron, Jim Cameron, as in the Hollywood film director of Avatar, Terminator, and Titanic fame. The reason for that, obviously, was he's a sort of known environmentalist, and also Avatar was quite clearly the most obvious sort of environmental destruction parable you could wish for. And he had recently completed a very big budget series for Showtime on climate change. And when you can call on the likes of Harrison Ford and such, Leonardo DiCaprio as your on-screen talent, and you've got all his budget and you've got all his ability, you might think this was a real winner. But I asked him what had happened to the second series, and he said, well, it was cancelled. I said, why was that? He said, because we didn't sell enough soap. So the implication being that even someone of his ability and his opportunity, and the hands on the kind of levers he has, struggles to get environment into the mainstream media. And I thought it was quite a sobering lesson. But I don't want that to be too depressing. To quote from another of his movies, no fate but what we make for ourselves. So if we can make a better fate for ourselves here, that would be great. Now, the structure of this, I want the gentleman on my left to maybe say just a few words about themselves. A couple of them have clips to show, and I think we may as well show them in the introduction by way of setting out your stalls. Is that all right? Yeah? Yep. But I'm not sort of particularly into long prepared speeches, but by all means, if you've got a particular point or a particular issue you want to get across by what you think would help to set the scene, that would be great. So just in order of those sitting next to me, I'm going to start off with Richard Bowron, who's a freelance now development executive, formerly with Love. Richard, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your concerns are.
I've been with Love Productions in mainly development, but also exec producing for about the last 4 or 5 years. And I've been a series producer and development producer in various different independent companies. So So my link, I suppose, to this particular subject is sort of sporadically over the years, being a big subject, I would have thought, you know, this is something I would like to sit around with a team and see if we can brainstorm ideas, frequently with very little success, and I would move on to other subjects. But about 18 months ago, with a sort of concerted effort through a project through IBT and the JJ Charitable Trust, we spent a concerted period of 10 weeks attempting to come up with sort of ideas which either addressed climate change or reflected the situation, mainly, it must be said, from a more kind of popular end of television. So that's I'm not a sort of specialist factual producer, although I have done some stuff in that area. My areas tend to be more sort of popular factual formats, constructed documentaries, that sort of thing, social experiments. And having spent that concerted period of time, obviously, you know, it takes time in TV to win commissions. I'd say we haven't won any at this precise point, and I think this is one of the things that we'll probably address, is that there is a real difficulty around this area, which seems, I think, a bit strange for a subject that is so important to everybody. So I think that's something that I'd like to bring into the discussion today, is probably from the more popular end, and possibly addressing some of the hurdles that I've faced in both development of ideas and trying to get them to the screen. And it's not all bad news, but I think it's quite good for us to address where problems do arise in this particular area.
Thank you. Just before I introduce Tony, I should have mentioned in the introduction, as far as possible, I want this to be a conversation. So if, as someone is speaking, you've got a particular issue or a question or maybe experience you can bring to that, please put your hand up and we'll find you with a microphone. So, you know, if that thought comes up in your head, feel free to raise your hand. Tony Dillamore is development executive with Boundless Productions, and I think, Tony, as well as speaking, you have a little clip yourself, is that right?
Yeah, so again, I have a sort of similar experience in terms of Richard working with the IBT recently to get some development funding along with Sainsbury's to work on sort of factual features versions of programs which would look at this type of content. But as an example of something that we do which has sort of applicable climate change content in a sort of whereabouts way, I was going to show a clip from Grand Designs from an episode in 2008. If we can show that.
This place is so experimental, Cambridge University have sensors embedded all over the house to monitor its performance, to see how the walls and floors store and release heat, how well the revolutionary solar panels generate heat and power, and much more. This place has the capacity to generate energy and sell it back to the grid.
The cost of running this house should be minimal. Every year, you know, I'll get a bit back, hopefully.
Because we're getting paid for the electricity we're producing, and we're getting paid for the heat we're producing. So the house is actually giving us an income at the end of the day.
How much do you reckon a year?
£1,800 a year is what we're currently told the house is going to generate as an income, net.
It's going to you're going to get a cheque for £1,800 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From the government.
Instead of paying bills,
Yes.
electricity and heating bills.
Yes.
Yes.
I have to just take that backed in because it's it's not normal.
No.
So really, that's an example of something that we looked at as a way of kind of packaging information, which is, you know, it's about climate change, but actually it's packaged in a way that is consumer, it's features, it's about people's lives every day in the domestic realm. It's about how they save money, but it's also obviously in the format of Grand Designs, which is big and ambitious and it's life-changing. And all of those things are things that we know work on television and bring an audience. So I'm sure we'll have more of a conversation about this as we go on. The difference between approaching climate change on the nose and then doing things which address those subjects through a different routes, whether it's sort of features content or fact-ent competitions or those other sort of shapes, and that's what we're interested in trying to do.
Tony, just just on grand designs, you mentioned it. Could you give us a feeling of how often or what kind of proportion of the properties would have some kind of environmental criteria in their design, and how much is it something that the producers actually look for?
So we definitely look for it. It's something that Kevin is keen on himself. We don't have a sort of quota of how many we want to get to. Always, the story is always king. You know, that's the case with grand designs. They have to be incredible builds, and more so as we go through the series. As you go through, I mean, that's from series 8, I believe, so that's sort of 2009. But as we've gone on, it's become a case where there just naturally is more of that sort of smart design. There's a lot more of it going on. We also made something last year called House of the Year, which had a lot, the Manser Prize, which had a lot of very smart design, lots of sort of very innovative heating techniques using sort of deep bore technology to heat homes and that sort of thing. So I think the fact that these technologies are becoming more and more interesting, and they're becoming more prevalent in home builds, just means that actually when we look at something like grand designs, they're just sort of naturally coming through much more. But we don't have a sort of quota or anything. But they make interesting programs, and they're things that do spark the imagination. You know, viewers want to. I think people are interested in the idea of saving money. They always have been. You know, the idea of having an incredible home that looks amazing, is brilliantly designed, but then is also going to make you sort of bill neutral within 12 months or 18 months or whatever, is incredibly appealing and horrible TV word, aspirational. You know, those are the sort of things that that we know work in grand design. So we're always going to keep an eye out for them.
I suppose that's the clearest hook for a programme. That watch this programme and you might learn how to get £1,800 a year from the government.
Yeah, exactly.
That's quite a good incentive to switch on. Thank you very much. Aiden Hansell from Love Productions. On you go.
Hi, so I'm the Head of Development for Love Productions as of about a month ago. I've spent the last 10 or 15 years, probably 15 years, developing mainly popular factual formats with people like Wall to Wall and Darley Smithson. And I started out in entertainment. I started out in making programs, well, way back, doing things like The Big Breakfast and Live and Kicking, and then the first 2 series of Big Brother. And I think the reason I've been asked by lots of companies to develop popular factual programs is that I try to come at them with a sort of entertainment head. So I think they have to entertain first. They have to draw people in, promise something exciting, promise something outrageous, and then you learn. And I think I challenge myself as a development producer to make people think and to hopefully educate them. There's a few examples of difficult subjects that have made good television, I think. I helped develop something called The Young Ones, which was about aging, which is not the easiest subject to bring to television. But because it was kind of a reality show, it had celebrities in it, it was very funny, it was edited as a kind of sitcom, and it made people watch a program that they wouldn't otherwise watch, I think, about aging, and really appreciate what was positive about aging. So I think the challenge for program makers and people who are developing ideas about climate change is kind of to do the same thing, to try and think first what's entertaining, what do people want to watch anyway, what are people interested about anyway. And the other thing I'd want to say is I went to a session at the BBC, which was about climate change and how to develop ideas that commissioning editors will jump on. There was a lot of willingness, I have to say, from the BBC to commission ideas in this area. They recognise that it's an important subject. But I think there is a difficulty. It's sort of a double hurdle to jump. There's the hurdle of coming up with the right idea, and then there's the hurdle of will anyone actually care? I think climate change is such an intangible subject, and what we need to do is make it tangible, find things that people do care about, that do matter to them, and do the basic research, find out the things that we can all do to make a difference, and then build an idea around that. It might be just one small aspect. It might be just flights, or it might be just, energy efficiency, or it might be consumption generally, and try and work out how that resonates in people's lives, and build an idea that that kind of allows you to play with that in an entertaining way.
Just something that occurs to me when you're mentioning the ageing story, the sort of great advantage of that is it's a very human story, and we all engage very readily in that kind of material. I think sometimes the problem with climate change related stuff is it can seem almost rather sort of misanthropic. You know, humans are the problem, so it's difficult to make it sort of engaging in a human sense. Yeah,
I think it can. I mean, people have, there are various different approaches. There is the sort of the landmark, this really matters, the sort of Al Gore, inconvenient truth. But you can only do that so many times. I think largely the argument's been won. We all believe that climate change is happening. And actually there is an appetite among people. At the session I went to, there were lots of young people there, lots of people in their sort of 18s and 20s, because it was mainly aimed at BBC Three. And there was a real appetite to know, to understand the mechanisms of climate change, but also to really know what they could do, what in their daily lives they could do, what were the 10 things that mattered most that they could do about climate change. So, sorry, I've forgotten the question.
Well, it was just in relation to the human element of ageing.
Yeah, stories. I have pitched, so I should also say I have pitched various different approaches to climate change. I pitched one which was a sort of fact-ent idea about cutting back on consumption, which was a more sort of features idea. I've also pitched science-led ideas, sort of science missions, where obviously the appeal is the adventure and seeing scientists at work. But again, it's hard to, even that feels a little bit on the nose. The other one I pitched to BBC Three was about sort of man-made disasters, which is a pretty grim subject, but grim subjects can work quite well sometimes on BBC Three. So, Worst Place to Be a Bin Man was a pretty grim programme, but arguably that was about climate change, I think. So sometimes I think you can actually use that, the sort of human appeal of a story to make people think, and taking you to maybe the places on the planet where climate change is already having an effect is one possible avenue, I think.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, Craig Hunter, who's currently today standing in for Tom MacDonald, is commissioning editor of Specialist Factual Format and Natural History. And Craig, I guess a lot of people are looking to you as the gatekeeper.
I know, I feel slightly outnumbered here. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. Yes, apologies if you expected to see Tom here. So I commission Specialist Factual Formats and Natural History, and I would say that, and I would defend the position of the BBC in particular with natural history, and that I think that climate change and environmental issues and poaching and all the big hard-hitting subjects that a lot of us are sometimes too scared to even pitch actually permeates a lot of the content that we've got. So things like Operation Iceberg, Planet Earth 2, Attenborough Meets Obama, Nature's Epic Journeys, Big Blue Live on BBC One last year. That they all had elements of environmental issues and climate change, which I think we addressed head on. I think the challenge for us and the people in this room is how do we package issues which are harder hitting and make it feel relevant and empowering. But just before I go on and to talk about that, I'm just going to play the pre-title of the Barrier Reef, please, the David Attenborough series that was on in January.
I have travelled the length and breadth of the Great Barrier Reef and used the latest techniques to watch its wildlife. But the reef has one more story to tell. The residents of this marine paradise have seen their habitat change rapidly within the last few decades. And time is running out for them. The Barrier Reef is facing one of the most serious challenges to its continued existence, the effect of human beings. But there is hope. This time, our research vessel, the Elusia, will be taking me to meet teams of scientists who are developing new ways to try and save it. And I'll be going to its deepest parts, where new discoveries are being made that might hold clues to its survival.
Nobody has ever dived as deep as this before on the Great Barrier Reef.
This is one of the greatest and most important ecosystems on the planet. And what happens here affects us all. So, what does the future hold for this complex wonder?
So that was on BBC One at the beginning of the year. David first visited in 1957 and went back to see it and obviously chart the sort of the decline of the barrier reef. And I think we addressed it in particular in Programme 3. We hit climate change, human interference head on, but we did so by science. And actually I would say that it's maybe easier in natural history to bring across the climate change argument. I think we do it because otherwise it would be seen as irresponsible if we're trying to showcase big blue chip natural wonders but not actually talk about the impact that humans are having on them. That's 50% of my job, which is natural history commissioning. The other 50% is specialist factual formats, which is basically specialist factual content dressed up in a really entertaining and fun way. And the thing I would say about specialist factual formats is that we've had huge success with shows that are related to health, puppies, health. It's, if you think about what's the DNA of all of those shows, it's actually really useful information. The audience at 8 o'clock in particular are quite greedy. They're also quite selfish. And they also want to get quick take-home facts that they can use in their day-to-day lives. I don't get pitched ideas on climate change at that time for 8 o'clock. And I think that's the area that we need to be really concentrating. If we're really serious about trying to bring climate change in particular to a mass audience, we've got to think of a way that dresses it up and makes it really useful.
You don't even get pitched ideas then?
Very rarely. I mean, genuinely, very rarely will get pitched ideas in that space.
And why do you think that is?
I think there's an issue that people feel that climate change, environmental issues are not going to bring in a large audience. And I cannot agree. I cannot say strongly enough that it's really, really important for us, especially as the BBC, from public service, to make sure that we are doing those subjects. We've got a big series that's in production at the moment about poaching. It's going to be difficult to bring an audience into that space, but we're doing it and we believe it's the right thing to do.
Do you think there's a bit of self-censorship going on? People
Absolutely.
thinking,
Yeah.
there's no way this will work.
Look, don't get me wrong. Of course, commissioners sit there and they've got the pick of the bunch and they can choose what ideas. And there's also other things that they've got to weigh up in terms of other home ideas that might be on the telly at the time or other ideas that they've got in development. Excuse me. But what we don't get is really useful take-out climate change ideas.
Just while the mic's coming, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, part of that isn't that there aren't ideas. I think that the producers are wary of the response of commissioners if you headline, particularly in a sort of an 8 o'clock, more sort of popular end, if you headline it as a climate change idea, it feels like it's dead in the water, but you haven't, that's not a proper, that isn't an idea, is it?
No.
Climate change, it doesn't really sort of...
No.
That
isn't the programme.
But if you come in and said to me, I want to do a 3-part series on climate change, I'd say, great, what do you want to do?
Yes,
what's the next stage beyond that?
I think a lot of producers are probably aware of the fact that that's maybe something that is an element within. It's got to be about people. And where's the narrative going to come from? And I think one of the things about this session is your climate change idea. I think we need to sort of think about the scope of what that might include. And I think for sort of the more 8 o'clock popular end of television, it's probably things to do with consumerism, changes of lifestyle, but probably not with climate change as a sort of headline as such.
But it's funny because I hear people saying to me quite often things like, you don't want to be on the nose with it. I disagree with that entirely. I think you absolutely need to be on the nose with it. I think the audience really want you to be on the nose with it as well. I did a film called The Great Big Energy Saving Challenge. You couldn't be more on the nose than that. And I think
it's good to hear that because actually, historically that's not tended to be the response I've had.
What my point was that actually, if we've had success in specialist factual formats like Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, for example, on health, which is one of our longest running and most successful brands, we do not have the equivalent in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Trust me, I'm a climate scientist.
Yeah, as a scientist, yes, please, thanks.
If it's relevant to say who you are and where you're from, feel free.
Okay, my name is Lucy Siegel, and I'm a journalist and a broadcaster, and I've spent the last 15 years ostensibly as an agony aunt for the environment, for newspapers, particularly The Observer. And I have been through several rounds of, things almost coming to air and pilots and blah, blah, blah. So there's a couple of points I want to make off the back of what you've said. First of all, as an environmentalist, as an ecologist, and any ecologists in the room will know that a flourishing ecosystem is biodiverse. There is not one solution. And part of the problem is that I think we're all looking for the big climate change idea, the format. And there will actually be a huge variety. As some people have already alluded to, there have been shows which are about climate change, kind of, anyway, because climate change dominates all of this space, obviously. I think, in a way, we kind of need a big therapy session, because there's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of baggage here.
I'll sign up.
Huh?
I'll sign up.
Yeah. I'm happy to conduct a therapy session. There's a lot of baggage here. You know, we've all probably been through the mill a bit with this subject. I remember quite a few years ago, John Plowman, head of comedy at the BBC, I wrote a piece, A Climate Change Diet. I mean, this must be 10 years ago. And he convened all the comedy producers around it. It was the only time I went to the 6th floor, the execs floor in the old BBC building. And we had a big meeting about how we could do this. And it really felt like there was momentum behind it. There was a political reason why all of that got shut down, and climate change coverage became an incredibly political hot potato. And that's why it has stagnated to a certain point. We're coming out of that now.
Sorry, just to be clear, you mean it stagnated politically because what?
Well, there was a question of balance at the BBC, wasn't there? So you had to bring in a climate change skeptic for every time you were articulating that point of view. It's great now; it's a settled science, and we don't have to go through that pantomime anymore. So we're actually in quite a strong position, and I think we're still coming to this with the kind of, oh my God, this is impossible. I think we need to take our cue, actually, from some of the big brands who are working on cutting emissions in supply chains, and some very, very chewy, granular research and applying it to their supply chains. And all the research that they've done shows, we talked about Grand Designs. Grand Designs is aspirational. That's the joy of watching that show. I'm not going to fit those solar panels or whatever. I don't even have a house, you know. It's like, but I watch it and I lap it up because it's aspirational. And I think inspire and delight. And even within this very, very difficult subject, we should be finding those stories and bringing them through. I have endless enthusiasm for this subject. I don't want to be oppressed by it all the time.
Okay, there was a lady here who had a question, and then we'll just get the panel to respond to a couple together. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sian Ferguson from the JJ Charitable Trust, one of the Sainsbury Family Charitable Trusts that's supporting
Bring the mic a little closer to you.
Supporting this work with IBT for 4 years. And I remain incredibly frustrated that climate change is still seen, and I'll take issue here with you, Tom, as an environmental issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's an economic, it's a health, it's a social, it's a cultural issue that's shaping human progress and will shape human progress. The questions around the Zika virus at the Olympics this year. Zika virus is where it is because of climate change. You know, that's not contentious. And I think we mustn't lose sight of those issues. We're already on a transition to a low-carbon economy. We saw that with the clip from Grand Designs, which is nearly 10 years old. I mean, that shows how slow, you know, TV and the media is moving on this. The question is, will we get to a low-carbon economy quick enough? So actually, Craig, your programme was wrong. There is very little hope for the Great Barrier Reef at the moment. We have to decarbonise within about 10 years for us to get there. You know, there's a huge progress. Now, that sense of urgency is not reflected, and nor is what we actually need to do about it. It's not about turning off your light. This is about taking carbon out of the energy system. This is you know, the big oil companies. This is the political will. It's really not relying on individual consumers to put on an extra sweater. It's bigger than that, and it's more exciting than that.
Well, more exciting is interesting. Do you think your slightly more alarming prognosis, you may, or you clearly do, strongly believe that it is the core truth in this? If that's the case, how do you make interesting and engaging television that doesn't, and we've seen this sort of frightening approach to climate change probably fail in the past. So if you think that's the way it should be done,
I don't believe it's the way. I think climate change is an issue, elicits fear and guilt.
Mm-hmm.
and it's now in some countries, particularly in the UK, the US, and Australia, a political issue. It's still seen by some as a political choice to believe or not, or whether you do something about it. And I think that's the real challenge of this. So I don't think it's easy, and whether it's on the nose or smuggled in, all of these things are important. But given how significant this issue is for all of us, it's hardly covered.
Okay.
One thing I'd say is one thing that does get commissioners' interest is a good stat, and given the title of this How to Pitch Your Climate Change Idea, there are some extraordinary stats, and following on from your point about the urgency of this, a lady at the session that I was at, Emily Shookborough, had a number of those facts at her fingertips. I've only got a couple. I think we've got more carbon in the atmosphere today than at any time since the Pliocene, which was 3 million years ago. And in the Pliocene, sea levels were 25 metres higher than they are today. 25 metres. So that's kind of where we're headed if the carbon levels stay where they are. Also, she said that the next car you buy, in order to hit that 2-degree target, the next car you buy needs to be an electric one. We need to get rid completely of diesel and petrol cars, which would make Top Gear a very, very different programme. And one more fact that I found out when I was researching about the Southern Ocean. The sea ice that we all know is disappearing is responsible for this cycle of bringing nutrients up from the bottom of the sea. And the marine algae depends on that cycle. And the marine algae that we really only, you might see it on a nature program as a big bloom in the sea. That makes 80% of the oxygen we breathe, 80%. So if the sea ice goes, that nutrient cycle gets depleted and the oxygen gets depleted. So if people don't care about carbon dioxide, perhaps they'll care about oxygen. So I think partly our job is to dig out these tiny little, these very significant facts and present them to commissioning editors. And as I was saying, try and build a framework, build a form around these issues.
Well, take your 25-metre one, your sea level one. I mean, that's actually easily grabbable, and I guess, just off the top of my head, I suspect a large proportion of the GDP of the world is probably generated in that altitude between sea level and 25 metres. So is there something that says, how could we move the world 25 metres up, as a sort of absurdist notion, but I mean, how would you kind of build a format, or perhaps someone else has got an idea here.
No, but I think absurdist notions make really, really good formats.
Exactly.
So there was a great one. I didn't choose a clip, but if I was going to choose one, it would have been from 2009 when climate change was the big issue. And it was Bang Goes the Theory. It's called The Human Power Plant. And they got a family to live in a house. I don't know, you might have commissioned this. They got a family to live in a house, and then they got 80 cyclists to secretly power the house through the day without telling the family what was going on. And the family were making Sunday roasts, and they were putting on the toaster, and they were leaving the fridge door open. And every time they did anything, a whole bunch of cyclists had to get on and pedal like hell. And they had to sort of try and keep it within a particular range, otherwise the house would go dark. And I remember that as just a really visual demonstration of energy, and a really it sticks in my memory since then. I particularly remember the fridge door. When they left the fridge door open, there was a panic because that was using up power. So literally people were running to get onto the bikes, another 6 people were required. And I still remember that, and I do close my fridge door. So I think the real challenge is to come up with formats that are entertaining at the outset, but then actually do inspire action and stick in the memory.
That's what I was saying earlier in terms of actually 2009 was a very good example of it, because I think there were more programmes, and certainly in that time, that the human power generator that you're talking about, the reveal when the family went and saw who was behind the doors was phenomenal. And it was filled, absolutely jam-packed with take-home, usable information. That's the sort of thing that I think we need to be doing in a way that makes it very accessible to a television audience.
You mentioned that was 2009, and your clip earlier was from that date. Is there a problem now that this is no longer news? That it's no longer novel? So one of the key things that it may have had in between 5 and 15 years ago was novel and, yes, contentious, which up to a point helps. And that now we don't have that anymore. So there's a sort of, unfortunately, sort of ennui has arrived before we've delivered the right kind of action.
No, I don't think that's right. I think actually it's about, there's new science happening all the time, which is very television worthy. I've got another clip which I might tee up actually here, which is from the David Attenborough series, which is about trying to find those scientists who are out there, who are doing the work that we can then bring to the screen and then celebrate the work that they're doing. So do you want to play that clip?
Is that at hand? If it's not to hand, I can bring in a question. But are you? Yeah, but let's let this lady make a quick point, just while you're teeing it up. Yes, madam.
Short point is talking about useful facts. The fact that really took my attention recently was only 9 companies, 9 energy companies are responsible for 68% of all the carbon. Now, that is a great TV fact. There are 9 villains.
How do you make that into a television show?
Because they're villains, there's good and baddies and there's hope. If you gun for those companies, you have a villain and you have a character, you have narrative, you have chronology, and you've got something to give you hope. It's not endlessly saying, oh, we can't do anything. You can. It gives the viewer the real manageable hope that there's only 9 people to gun for. Shell, Exxon's been taken down but the Rockefellers have disinvested from Exxon already. They're already proving that they knew. So there's really big villains out there that are sitting in our country that own the pension funds. They're in your and my pension funds.
They're also keeping the country powered, lit and moving. Now, they might be doing it wrong, but to come at them from one side, I mean, that kind of agitprop would be
Saudi's just pulled out of solar. Saudi's pulled out. Sorry, Saudi's pulled out of oil already. The turn is here, and we have it in our hands now to make really powerful programs with passion, commitment, and hope. That's the thing, and narrative and characters. You can nail those people. There is something there that we can do with television. I'm convinced of it. That's not looking back and saying, oh, we can't fix the barrier.
Okay, thank you. Just before we hit lots of hands, just have this clip and then we'll bring
it's
in
the, It's the Barrier Reef one, not the one that you just teed up there. That looked like another one.
Okay.
Each of these tanks contains a miniature coral reef with the same species of coral, but each is being subjected to slightly different conditions of temperature and acidity, the 2 factors that are most likely to alter with climate change. Using these tanks, scientists have shown that increasing acidity restricts hard corals from building their limestone skeletons. And a rise in temperature, a single degree centigrade warmer than normal, can cause corals to become so stressed that they eject the photosynthesizing algae that enable them to grow and give some color. So they bleach, turning ghostly white.
If you go back in time, you can see the big, swings between ice ages and the warm periods where the Great Barrier Reef disappears and regrows, and that's happened numerous times. So whereas we've always had changes, but we're talking about changes over 10,000 years in those cases. What we're now seeing is the equivalent in a few decades. And that, of course, is stretching life's capacity to keep up. Organisms, ecosystems are falling behind as the world changes faster than it has in this enormous amount of time.
It's been shown here that a rise of just 2 degrees centigrade will turn a healthy reef into a decimated one. And such a rise will almost certainly happen in these seas if we continue to do what we are doing.
Do you want to cut there, actually? Sorry, it's going on a bit longer than I thought it was.
As Ove's test... Sorry
about that. So, my point was about the new science that's out there, and it's about how you bring that science to a mainstream BBC One audience. So, you might say that the series is wrong because of the future of the reef. I would actually argue that what that does, that clip like that, actually really brings an audience who otherwise might not have tuned into something because it's climate change on the nose, but features very, very heavily in something like that.
Thank you. Yes, sir? Yes, it is.
Hi, my name's Tyler. I'm a cameraman and producer with a science background, so I'm a bit strange. But I wanted to maybe address something that I've kind of recently thought about with TV and feature docs, particularly ones with a social change message or an environmental message. How much can a TV documentary or format really take a role in activism? How possible is that? Because based on the previous comments that we had before, yes, there are things that people can do in their homes, and that's very useful, and I'd love to see more of that on television. But the reality is that if we really take this issue seriously, there are many strategic audiences in power that need to be reached with these messages that the general public really has very little power to change the realities of this situation. Excuse me. So obviously feature docs like Al Gore's documentary and like The Age of Consequences that is here at the moment have like a general public audience, but also trying to reach policymakers and that sort of thing. I just wonder what role TV can play in that, rather than just the general public.
Okay, I'd like to put this to Craig and also one of our producers or development producers. Just Craig, first of all, because obviously with the BBC there are various editorial policy issues with regard to this when it becomes more campaigning. Perhaps you could just sort of talk us through a little bit where the boundaries lie on this.
So it is very difficult for the BBC to do campaigning programming. Of course it is, because of the way that it's funded, but also, what I would say about that is that there are ways around it. You can do polemical films in the BBC, and I think sometimes that we forget that people have got a voice, and if you've got a voice in this particular field, then it's really good, especially if they're personalities, to get out there and do a film on it. So Tom Edwards is here, another commissioning editor, and I know for a fact that we have conversations about campaigning pieces, but how do you get around it? How do we make sure that that our films have got a very strong flavour and they've got a particular take on it? So it's not something I shy away from. And having made some fairly controversial documentaries in my time, I relish the opportunity to try and take it on.
It was often said that the BBC could never have done, Hugh's fish fight, for example, which I know isn't strictly climate change, it was an environment thing, but it was a campaigning piece. It was broadly supported, although sometimes I think some of the arguments behind it were a little bit facile. But is it right that we would have really struggled to get that kind of public campaign? Beeb?
I think it's the take on how you would do something like Fish Fight. I developed that series with Keo Film, so I know about it quite well. But that was done with a particular flavour for Channel 4 because we absolutely knew what we wanted to do with it. And the discard rule that came off the back of that was not something that was actually didn't come up in the development. It came up in the production, and so it had a life of its own, that series. But it's just the take on it. And I think actually we would be able to do that film, or we'd be able to do that series, but slightly differently for the BBC. I wouldn't shy away from it.
Gentlemen, I don't know who wants to pick this up. Bearing in mind we're not just talking about the BBC here, there are other people who might have a lower barrier for campaigning films.
I think there's an interesting question here about the agenda that your programme has. It's something that we wrestle with all the time. It's quite simple when you're in a sort of development brainstorm to come up with an idea which you feel could work, which would be interesting, which would have lots of strong specialist factual content. I'm thinking about the BBC4 programme that was on last year, which was called Climate Change by Numbers, which was really great. But to a certain extent, you're preaching to the choir, I feel, a little bit with those programs. They have an audience that are going to watch them. You're not necessarily going to reach somebody that doesn't have that interest already. So the challenge for us, and certainly something that we've sort of tasked ourselves with doing, is finding other formats and other ways in which to sort of get that message across. And that just is a very, very, very difficult thing to do when when you want to go into a commissioner with your strongest ideas. It's often the case that those ones which have a sort of climate change message or whatever, they're not as strong because they're really difficult to make work, as you'll attest to, because you don't get pitched a lot of them, frankly. So, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, Richard, you wanted to come in.
I would say the answer to your bigger question is yes, there is a role for television to present campaigning films, to be polemic, to have an opinion, to try and change opinion, and I think the fish fight's an interesting one. At Love, we did a campaigning film on FGM, which contributed to a change in legislation, or saw that existing legislation was actually policed. So it is possible to make strong, that was with Channel 4, it's possible to make sort of strong, punchy films, I think, which will change opinion or might change the law even. But I think what I've struggled with this particular subject is to find the sort of hues of the climate change world who we could put in front of the camera, who have the passion, the anger, or whatever. I think that's one problem. And the other problem is what you were saying just now, which is the subject is so big. What part of it do you address which is kind of bite-sized that actually can be dealt with, which you could see some change being made? Whether it's an angry piece taking on a power supplier, or it's something to do with people's own sort of behaviour change, I don't know. And I think that's partly what I've grappled with, is who's the hero, who's the sort of pioneer campaigner.
But just 2 seconds, please, on this. I mean, just on the campaigning thing, it seems to me it's much easier to make campaigning films that don't require big changes by us. You know, if you're the fish fight doesn't require particularly changes by the audience. FGM, for a great percentage of the audience, doesn't require change for them. You know, even something about the Lord's Resistance Army or dolphins, I can get very animated because it doesn't mean me changing my lifestyle. There's a big difference in campaigns that do that and campaigns that I have to work on.
Yeah, I was thinking, if you think about, I have a little theory which I'll share, that the most popular programs put the viewer in the position of a judge. So, to take Big Brother as an example, the minute those guys walk into the house, you judge who you like, who you don't like, who's an idiot, who's going to win. And actually you get to vote on that. Bake Off's the same. You have your favourite, you have your character you want to win. And I think people love being put in that position. Viewers love being put in that position of being Mary Berry, being Paul Hollywood. And I think on climate change there is a relevance, because I think actually, although activism is important, that is kind of preaching to the converted. And I think the power does lie with the mainstream. You know, the richest pop artists are the ones who make records that everyone likes, you know, the Coldplays and the Elton Johns. So I think there is a room for opinion-changing programs for campaigning, but also I think it's really important that we make climate change programs for the mainstream to subtly change behaviour and to subtly change what people think, and to change small things in a million people's lives rather than one person deciding to...
And on who's being judged, it would be us after all. Yes, lots of hands. A lady with the mic, yeah.
Hi there, my name is Beth Brooks. I'm a PD working in natural history and also across features. And it seems to me we're all sitting here talking about this because we all want to see climate change not happen. We all want to make that change. I work sometimes with Comic Relief, making films that essentially show really difficult, hard issues, children dying from malaria. And we know that when you present that really hard issue in a really broad sense, people just stand back and go, there's nothing I can do about that. But if you tell the story of one little child who may end up dying because there's not a net over their bed, it's much easier for them to engage with it. And I wonder I know there's an urgency clearly for climate change, but it's that, exactly following on from what you just said, it's that drip feeding of really small bits of information right through the schedule that I think can elicit change.
Okay, I want to do some other hands up. Yes, you're lucky you've got the mic passed to you. Go on, and then we'll have the gentleman, I think, is it someone there? Yep, on you go, sir.
Hello, my name's Alex Marlowe. I worked on the Great Barrier Reef production and on David Attenborough Meets President Obama. I was doing some of the climate change fact-checking from the transcripts of that interview. But yes, I was in the digital team where we were trying to make an interactive website that would accompany the production and also the Great Barrier Reef dive, virtual reality dive to go with the show. And hopefully that kind of, those kind of new media formats will also help reach a wider audience and younger audiences and stuff. I think one of the things that's challenging is in terms of linking it to action and helping the audience see how they can do something about it, is tough for a number of reasons. And I think, one of the best things we can do is to kind of highlight really exciting cutting-edge science. So I think that's, in episode 3, that was a good way of doing it because it's very television worthy and it grabs attention. But obviously that's going on in remote laboratories, very, very niche cutting-edge science. The thing that's difficult is obviously, if we're a production company or the BBC, is that you're not a campaign organisation, and actually you can't link to NGOs and kind of more action-based campaigns. So,
can I just ask you, in your material that you were producing, first, was there any element that sort of linked, what you might be doing as you read this, or the kettle you're boiling, to what's happening in the Barrier Reef? Was there any element of that, and was there any ever suggestion that there should be any element of that?
We actually initially were going to do a project. The website was originally going to be how to save the reef.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was going to involve some behaviours of ours.
Yes.
Yeah.
But actually, it's sort of not quite. It's not really the role of a production company.
So someone decided that wasn't a good idea.
It's.
Or yeah, but.
I mean, just for example, so in the Great Barrier Reef show, a lot of that research is from the Australian Institute for Marine Science. Okay. Now, they're a scientific organisation. They're not a political campaigning organisation. So you can understand why institutions like that are contributing don't want to be linked to a particular campaign.
Yeah,
so I just think.
We're not the Australian Scientific Organisation, broadcast organisation with the BBC,
Sure.
and we should be fair to that.
Sure.
Craig, would you have liked to have seen an element of sort of what you can do about this on at least the web content of the programme?
I think so. I mean, certainly wasn't the USP of the series, was not to go and say, well, if you turn off your kettle, that was not the role of it. However, I think we can get better at actually having a digital platform using VR, for example, which was astounding. I thought it was amazing, but as a way of actually linking it back and making it feel relevant. Relevant is one of the key words, I think, from a specialist factual world that we need to get better at using, which is how is this going to be relevant to me? And that doesn't mean just because it's a big blue chip series that it's not relevant.
Okay, got lots of questions, and I do want to get some responses. Yes, if you can make it nice and punchy, that'd be
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Darren Eagles. I happen to have a short film in the RE Festival, so if you can spot it, it's got a climate change issue later today. I just wanted to make the quick point is that we've all recognised that we've moved from a period of uncertainty to consensus on what the cause of climate change is. We've not moved to a period of consensus on what the solutions are. So things like, a wind power, Lovelock still advocating nuclear. So yes, we can kind of advocate trivial changes like wearing jumpers, but we can't say to the public at this point, wind power is the panacea, is the solution. And that's one of the problems as filmmakers. Yes, we can do these small interventions, but we can't get behind one central big idea. We can recognise where it's come from, where the problems come from. So, that's just the point I want to make, really.
Lady behind you.
No. Hi, I'm wondering if adding a human element to these stories that we've got would be beneficial and whether you agree with that. These aren't my views myself, but I think people have this idea that the environment and nature has been around way before us and can continue to heal itself, hence why the ambition to actually try isn't there. I think there are the classic cliched human story is obviously the kids we've got in Africa, in Ghana, in India that live on these massive landfill dump sites, but also there are stories closer to home. I know 3 people whose dogs have died from eating palm oil on a commercial beach. Every time, probably once every 3 months, whenever me and people I know go in the sea, we get ill. And this is happening in England, and I think adding that human element, that relationship to people and what actually climate change is doing small scale to us, I wonder if that could be beneficial.
Yeah, feel free to respond to any of those thoughts. But just
I was going to say, I think it's absolutely vital. If you think the vast majority of what we're drawn towards on television is the human element. I think, the wildlife stuff is absolutely fantastic, and people are drawn towards the animal side. But it's like, it's about us. The stories about us are obviously really important. I think, just to pick up on something you said, Sian, about what would a low carbon economy look like. And I don't think it's about, TV doesn't tend to do giving up stuff very well. I mean, that's the death of quite a lot of pitches in this area. As soon as it's sort of like, stop doing this, this and this, there's a sort of an absence of narrative. It's like sitting around doing nothing. So I think what I've personally tried to do is to look at ideas which are about, rather than consuming and shopping, it's actually making and doing. And that immediately gives you some sort of starting point for what could end up being quite interesting television, because that's replacing perhaps spending an awful lot of time consuming and therefore contributing to a high carbon economy. It's more to do with sort of a lifestyle that gains benefit from making stuff and doing things and the experience of it. And I know that sounds possibly a little bit hippie, but actually it's not a bad starting point for a brainstorm about sort of popular ideas involving people.
It's funny you should mention hippie. As I was coming here today, I was thinking about The Good Life and thinking how, wow, did that get that kind of message into a very, very popular format? And I have no idea if anyone knows if that was deliberate on behalf of them or if it was just a sort of caricature couple at the time. But
I do know it took 3 series for people to actually sort of enjoy it. So that's quite an interesting
Is that
one.
right?
Yeah, I wonder whether we'd stick with it now. No.
Tony, I got the feeling you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say sort of a point on the disconnect in terms of sort of consumerism and the results of that consumerism. I think, and the human stories, it has been done before, and it has been done successfully, and it was on BBC Three. It's a series that ran over 3 series, which was the Blood, Sweat and franchise, which I worked on when I was at Ricochet, and that was Blood, Sweat and Takeaways, Blood, Sweat and T-shirts, and then Blood, Sweat and Gadgets. And that, in the most sort of visceral, active, exciting way possible, took young people halfway around the world to come face to face with the consequences of leaving the kettle on, or buying gold, or buying crap sweatshop created garments or whatever they were. And I think when you have something like that which has worked and landed and done really well, but then on the other hand you have something earlier, which was 2006, which was something called Dumped, which I don't know if anyone remembers, which was on Channel 4, which was a big, bold, had a massive marketing budget behind it. It had a massive top line about going and living on a dump and trying to sort of have a sustainable existence there. And for all intents and purposes, it didn't do very well. It was a disappointment ratings-wise and all that kind of thing. And so I think producers sometimes look at those things, and there's a wariness, because you try and tackle these things, and sometimes they work, in the case of sort of the BBC Three Blood, Sweat and franchise, and then other times it hasn't worked, basically.
I just want to pick up on the human interest point the lady made, which is, or human almost victim, really, saying, haven't we got a problem that for now and for probably quite a few years hence, it's not going to say climate change on anyone's death certificate? It's not robustly going to say, it's very difficult even now to say this such and such a person is a victim of climate. And usually, my limited experience of going to places where we think the extremes of climate change are being felt, the Arctic, Bangladesh, that's not what they blame either. That's not what they see. There's a kind of difficulty in bringing humans in.
This is not humans, but actually, did anyone see the press this morning? There's the first mammal in the Barrier Reef, which has been wiped out, and they are attributing it solely to climate change. So, so that's the very, very first time that they've been able to say, and it was in the press this morning. It's very small.
Yeah, gentlemen, wants to come in there, but yes, you'll want to come in, Aiden. I think
we might be about to say the same thing.
Okay,
but I think you're wrong.
On what point? Go on.
I think there are humans right now in other places whose lives are being very seriously affected by
I think they
climate
are.
change.
Well, give me your example, or perhaps you, sir. Yeah. Just quickly. Yeah. Sorry.
you know, they know. It's very clear. You know, it's actually only Anglo-Saxon countries where people don't connect these things. Generally, South America, they know. So there's, just to say that they don't know, there's lots of people that know what's going on. Anyway, that's
Thank you.
Just
Yes,
correcting
ma'am.
that. To show how we're all connected and all our actions are connected to effects all around the world. I think that's one thing. And maybe it's not about one big solution that we have to hold on to. You know, that this gentleman was saying, like, we need one big idea to hang on to. You know, like the lady over there was saying, we need lots of different ideas, like intercropping. You know, mass cultivation of food doesn't work. It's about intercropping, and that's. Yeah.
Yeah, just hang on, Lucy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
But well, I've got one little comment. Was my brother is an ecologist, and he several years ago he managed to get a storyline. It wasn't about climate change, but it was about the environment. He was protection officer for water voles in 3 counties in England, and cows coming to the river banks to graze and to get water in the river were destroying the water voles habitats in riverbanks. So he got a storyline worked into The Archers on Radio 4. And at the same time, he gave guidelines to farmers about it. Like,
we've seen how good at campaigning, in effect, the Archers.
No, but one really important point is now in Ireland, we've just had a general election, bit of a disaster, but one re-elected Kerry TD, Member of Parliament, actually said, the weather's in God's hands. He said, we've had the famine and we've had the ice age, and sure, we survived those. So I don't think we even do have an agreement.
Nature will heal itself. Yes.
One of our biggest climate heroes is actually Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, who is actually, I suppose, and he and other leaders of central banks understand the economic consequences to us, to all of us, about climate change, and particularly the issue around the carbon bubble. So we know that most of the fossil fuel assets owned by the fossil fuel companies in which our pensions are invested in can't be burned. They just can't be burned. They will be stranded. So there's a real economic risk of that. 80% and 90% of those assets can't be used. Shell had to borrow from the banks to pay the dividends for this year's shareholders. It shows there's a huge financial risk at stake. So it's not just about the distant consequences for people that we don't necessarily relate to, who are on the banks of rivers that might flood. Actually, there's a real pressing economic issue for all of us today. Insurance companies won't price in climate risk because they say they'll price it every year. So suddenly you'll get an increase in your insurance. So it begins to bite. You can't forecast when that's going to happen. So I think it's really important that we identify some of those issues. And I just have to come... Okay, so the fossil fuel companies are holding back progress. We're on an energy transition and they are deliberately holding back progress. There are vested interests that aren't challenged. We do know what we need to do. We don't need to turn off the kettle. We need different energy coming through the wires to our kettle.
What you just said about the fossil fuel companies is a view, and I've got quite a lot of sympathy with it, actually, but it's not a programme. And so certainly for the last half hour, we've kind of talked a lot about the problems of pitching climate change ideas. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the solutions to how to pitch a climate change idea. And I will bring you in, but I'm going to lady you haven't heard from yet at the back there. Yes, please.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
I think what's just been said is very important because I think we have to recognise we are dealing with some very deep vested interests which also are affecting the way that broadcasting works, especially in public sector broadcasting. And I'd really like to know from the panel what you feel can be done to get current affairs to actually hit some of the issues that have been talked about here actually on the nail. I know how difficult it is to get current affairs broadcasting in this area, and I have a feeling that the vested interests are actually holding us back. I'd really like to know the panel's view, because my view is that it's not so much about informing the consumer, but actually tackling the vested interests. So Please,
Okay.
please tell us.
I'm going to very briefly answer part of that myself, because I've made, I think it's the 3 panoramas now related to energy. And I can safely say that we never had any influence from any vested interest on the outside in terms of what we should do in that sense. So I don't think this idea that there's a kind of black hand, certainly in the part of current affairs I've been involved in, is not the case. Is there enormous power in this? Yes, there is, and it is not just in the fossil fuel side as well. A lot of the energy lobbies have enormous power, both in terms of finance and in terms of public opinion. Just thought I'd bring that in. But yes, there was a vested interest for a start. Do you think that's relevant? And also, I'd quite like to pick up Sian's point about, could you? There's a strong belief that the being dictated to by, or the fossil fuel companies are both vulnerable and hiding their vulnerability. Could there be a program in these things?
A kind of economics journalist worth their salt would want to get to the bottom of that. I mean, it's not an area particularly represented on the panel, actually, other than you, Tom, but I think what it's touching on, and I think what we wanted to talk about probably for the rest of the session, is that is absolutely got to be part of the mix, isn't it? Is that, the economic journalists, the environmental journalists, whatever, should be getting those current affairs stories on the television. It should be reflected within the mix, clearly. I think we're looking at the sort of specialist factual natural history side of things, absolutely vital, and they're not only very popular programs, but they're also very high in impact. I would like to see a little bit more campaigning stuff, that we could find sort of a new spokesperson hero in the UK. I do take all the points you've said about how powerful stories from abroad are. I think what I'm trying to look at is what might be reflecting lifestyles within, a little bit closer to home, Europe, the UK, whatever. And yeah, some of the stuff at the more popular end to do with the lifestyle changes that, the vision of a future which is lower carbon. One of the, if you do think about this too much, it can be a little bit too overwhelming. So I tend to sort of hive off. I remember reading something where someone said, well, look, trying to sort of avoid climate change isn't really the issue now, it's how we're going to deal with it. And that was someone who was talking about technology. I was looking at some of the brilliant things that people are innovating to deal with the situation that we're in. And I think there are all sorts of different ways that this subject can be put into the televisual world, whether it's human interest stories, science stories, current affairs. And I think we all have a bit of a duty to try and push it in every way we can. Yes.
I think there are popular campaigning programs as well. So Watchdog, I don't think has done anything about climate change, but there's no reason why it couldn't. Consumers do have power. I know that the decision makers and all these vested interests have power, but there's no reason why a Watchdog item couldn't be about a packaging issue, or they do take on the big 6 power companies. So if enough people care about it, and if there's an imaginative enough way into it, then I think it could be done in a mainstream way. Yeah. And I think there's a lot around obviously at the moment about the euro, and there's this phrase affecting the British way of life. I think that's what people care about. Any way in which climate change can affect the British way of life. If you look for those things, that's where that's where the formats are going to come from.
That is a really interesting analysis, because sadly, I think a lot of people out there would think action to prevent climate change is going to affect the British way of life more than currently. Okay,
massively.
It's boiling the crab, but we might end up with a disaster. But so that is quite an interesting telling point.
So it's seaside towns are going to be affected, and people love seaside towns. So maybe there's a format about crumbling cliffs or saving the seaside from. It's fun looking in the zeitgeist, looking in the newspaper for those. Well, pensions is a really good example. I think people really care about their pensions. Maybe there's what I hope we can all find are those little touch points that people will watch a program because they feel it's about them, rather than looking at it from the other way around, from sort of climate change down.
Lucy, you're very coming. Yes, the microphone coming.
I saw a clip of Exodus yesterday. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's about the migrant crisis. And I would have thought on paper that doesn't look like a goer. I mean, if you ask viewers if they would like to see more about migrants, drowning, struggling in a boat, I would imagine lots of people would say no. It's like, it was one of the most powerful, I only saw a really quick clip, it's one of the most powerful and affecting things I've ever seen. And it just strikes me that, there's so much technical innovation with filming and sound and, like sound of climate change. There's just so much here. There's so many possibilities. And I just feel really, really frustrated that we're still talking about, and I don't mean this as I'm not trying to get at anybody here, but things like, pinning it all on one person who's going to lead, a white man who's going to lead this charge and, everything's going to coalesce behind this person. I think we need to be much more ambitious in the way that we think about this. And I think there is something wrong with this system because it is going to fail if we say, what does our audience want to see at 8 o'clock? Literally nobody is going to say more about climate change. So is there a way of getting around that?
I mean, to be fair to Tom, it seemed to be you were suggesting that you would lead at 8 o'clock rather than follow, or am I being a bit over hopeful?
I'm not sure what the metrics are, I think. I'm not sure.
I guess, it's just how, for me, it's about how you package it. How do you make it so it feels really bloody relevant and really useful for that audience at 8 o'clock? We know what their viewing habits are like. And so therefore, and we spend so much time poring over all that analysis. So therefore, we should be able to, and I echo everything that everyone else is saying in this room, but it's about how do you package it to make it feel accessible? That's the biggest problem that we've got.
Is there a way of just breaking away from the analysis and commissioning something like slightly absurd that doesn't tick all the boxes but could be kind of great? Because that seems to me like Exodus is that thing that maybe on paper wouldn't fit with the metric.
Give me 10 seconds on what Exodus is beyond about my...
Well, I don't know because I saw such I basically saw
Exodus is, Tom, you might need to help me here, but it's not from my slate as you can tell, but it's 100 cameras given to 100 migrants who, as they leave Syria, and they film it themselves, film the journey themselves.
Very interesting. Yeah. Yes, lady here. Yep. You can just take that one.
I agree with you. Exodus, it looks incredible. It's amazing, but it's also really hard viewing. And I think there will be members of the audience that will not want to watch it because it is very tough issues for them to face. And one thing we haven't spoken about here is the fact that TV is also a business and it is about ratings. And actually, obviously, the BBC are in competition with ITV and Channel 4 and Channel 5. And is it worth the main terrestrial channels getting together and having some agreement? And it sounds ridiculous to say because it is a business that, okay, we'll have elements of climate change in 50% of our programmes, however subtle it is, but while they're competing with each other, not just the BBC, of course, because commercial channels have a massive amount of competition. It's quite unfair for the BBC to be picked out in this situation because they've got so much grief from the government at the minute.
But actually, does
no, it's fine. I don't feel pitched.
Does the okay in the end, Whittingdale's bite wasn't as bad as his bark, thankfully. But there was still a sort of move towards distinct. There's a sort of thing about distinctiveness and maybe a little less ratings chasing. Do you think that actually just opens the door a little bit more, perhaps, to climate change?
I would say, without getting too political about it, that I actually think this has been the green paper and white paper getting ready for charter has been a really interesting exercise from our commissioning point of view because we are looking at our titles, we're looking through a reputational lens, we're looking at distinctiveness, and I think we are moving into a place now where I'm about to say something that I hate hearing from commissioners, but we should not and we do not always go after the ratings, and there is definitely an opportunity to blow the schedule apart or take some bigger risks on some bigger, higher-hitting reputational pieces. And if that means doing something which is, and I'm not saying I'm going to commission this, but if it was something called climate change, well then, it's about making a noise.
Do you, and I'm interested in anyone on the panel, think there is a case for an environment series on television? I made the point at the beginning that Costing the Earth is the only broadcast environment series. And I know I'm very well aware that Radio 4 and radio is different to television, but if the broadcasters wanted to make a statement and say, this is important, we will try and make it work, or is that just, ridiculous old-fashioned thinking? Could a dedicated slot, this is our environment slot, could that work?
I mean, from my point of view, I think it's covered in a number of different a number of different programs, everything from Countryfile through to Landward through to gardening programs. I don't think you need to do something which is absolutely an environmental show, personally, because I think it would
on all those
diminish
shows,
across.
climate change struggle to get in. Believe me, I mean, I know from Countryfile.
I'm not denying the fact that it struggles. Of course it struggles. We just have to get better and and think about how do we bring it to commissioners, how do we bring it to screen, which makes it feel like it comes back to the very first point I made. It's about how do we package, how do we make it feel accessible.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else think it would be a go, or is it a ridiculous notion?
Really difficult because of the genres that would be sort of clashing within a slot would be really, because there is going to be current affairs, there's going to be some science. I don't know if it's,
but I mean, it's
it might make a sort of TV
environment, or tomorrow's world for the environment. In effect, it's that kind of thing. It's or even a Top Gear for the environment, if you like. That it's the idea that here is a broad range of interest that people are interested in. Put something in there.
I don't think it would run and run.
Okay, fair point. Yes, folks out here. Oh, we seem to have managed to shut people up. Yes.
Thank you. Is there an interest and an appetite in your experience, and I guess what I'm asking also / budget, for ideas that are more fundamentally cross-platform? Because at the moment we're talking very much about kind of broadcast hours, broadcast half hours, but ideas that, because it strikes me as well, I've been thinking a lot about technology and innovation in this area, and actually the power that you hold in your hand with your phone. Is there an appetite and a budget and kind of the right people in the room to pitch ideas that feel less traditional and more cross-platform?
Has anyone had a go at bringing a lot of cross-platform into their ideas?
Honestly, they're harder to pitch. But I think there should be an ambition to involve digital as well. And you're absolutely right that the power, particularly, the younger audience, everyone's got a mobile, they're quite used to two screens. My son is always watching with a second screen. So I think absolutely we should be thinking about those things, but they are harder to pitch because...
Why are they harder to pitch?
Because commission editors don't understand or don't want to engage with something that isn't straightforward television. Present company obviously excluded, but I'm possibly channel controllers.
I think there's a feeling as well with those sorts of ideas sometimes that you need you need the traditional TV broadcast platform and a lot of money to drive people towards the digital platform to know it's there. And that's something that I've come across in terms of a barrier before. You can go in and you can pitch these ideas that have, additional sort of 360 digital platforms and interaction, that might actually impact upon the program that you're making if it's got a fast turnaround. I'm talking about sort of ideas where people, would vote in real time on an issue. We had an idea in development with the BBC which was like that, which would have had environmental issues being debated. But part of the problem I think is that sense that when they have been tried before, even on things like first dates and things like that, the kind of interactive element has been more underwhelming than they would have liked it to be, and so it's quite hard occasionally to to push people to those platforms. That's just my experience of sort of that.
We are getting better at it. I mean, we have got there's now a whole department which is now specifically looking at digital, social, which we haven't been. I don't think we've been quick enough in the past, and I think we are getting better at it now. I think the thing is you've got to ask yourself, what are you offering that you're not getting from the linear television project? And I think, so I think again, it's all about making sure that what you're offering, be it from social, digital, it just feels different and it feels innovative. So when you're talking about voting, interactivity is really strong, really good, but it just can't feel like it's the offcuts or the stuff that hit the floor.
There was a Spring Watch campaign, I think they've run it more than once, where everyone, all the viewers were invited to look at 10 species and when they turned up in the spring, which was really about climate change because they did it over 2 or 3 years, I think. And that did get a very large uptake because people love spotting stuff in their own gardens. So that was actually a sort of user-generated experiment and I think was actually quite valuable to scientists. So I think there might be room for similar sorts of things to do with weather or to do with mass observations that could involve a lot of people and taking photos on their phones or whatever. Just
being slightly more sceptical on this, I mean, I don't know if anyone's got the numbers, but is it the case that whilst, millions watch televisions, many millions in the case of some programs, still only a very small proportion of those are interacting online? I mean, do we know? Because in which case we have to be a little bit careful about spending money particularly licensed money, but even any money on something that's not really helping. Does anyone know what the figures are on these?
I don't know the figures, but I'd be interested to know what your experience is from other broadcasters and not just the BBC, for example. So Channel 4, ITV.
I think, if 1 million people watch the programme, somewhere between 10 and 50,000 will actually engage on another screen.
Okay.
In that order, I think.
Yeah. I think Springwatch is interesting as well because as far as my recollection goes, it was what Springwatch was already established by the time they brought that thing in, whereas the things that I've done have been trying to pitch brand new formats with that element alongside it, and then it's a case of the sort of marketing spend in order to let people know, because you're sort of having to promote both of those things at the same time. Otherwise, especially when it's an idea which depends on that interactivity, then it feels like it's a much bigger risk for them to put that spend in if it's a brand new program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, Joe.
Thanks. Partly this is just a reminder that I'm going to be leading on a report on climate change in television that will come out to coincide with a year on from the Paris talks. So it's been a really fascinating session so far, and I'd love anyone that wants to feed into that thinking to get in touch with me. So I'm Joe Smith. That's, Americans normally pause and wait for me to say what my real name is. It's joe.smith@open.ac.uk. One thing I wanted to share was what it felt like to be at the Paris talks. I've been to a few of the UN climate talks over the previous 15 years, and it was, the night of the agreement was something like a wedding feast. People had agreed to promise something long into the future that they didn't know how to do, and that was enormously ambitious. And the following morning, meeting friends in the press centre or a couple of policy seminars felt a bit like the first argument of a wedding. When we really dawned on us just how ambitious the proposition is to change our energy system in a really short space of time. I think that story alone is a story. Actually, it's thousands of stories. And similarly, something not really covered by the Paris Agreement, but of course the thing that's driving it is the mother of all jeopardies. The fact that we will have to live with climate change. We are in a climate-changed world already, and I think that it's correct to say natural history programming is trying to cope with that and relearn its practice in light of that. But again, I think learning to live in a climate-changed world is itself a story, and I think we ought to acknowledge the need for a division of labour across this, that soaps are going to pick up on some of those storylines, science specials are going to pick up on some of those storylines, and I sincerely hope that the creative people in this room, whether they're commissioners or makers, will come up with some new ideas, some new approaches to how we tell stories. And I'm really grateful for the intervention about other screens, because actually we haven't talked about the fact that you all face intense competition, and it's only going to go in one direction. So the need for all of us to step in with creativity and imagination about how we tell this story, which, as I say, does hold the mother of all jeopardies, it should be promising.
Thank you. Lady just behind there in the green. Quick, if you're coming to the end, and then the lady in the black there, yeah.
I'm also interested in the coverage of kind of green protests and stuff like that, because I've been to so many in London that just haven't been covered by news programs at all, and I think that's a good place to start. It's a free point of conversation there, and there are so many interesting things and feelings going on at those protests and events. For example, when Greenpeace made that huge kind of fracking thing outside the House of Parliament, and I just think that they're just not covered at all compared to other issues, and I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts or where that might be going.
About a little over a year ago, I was actually in discussions with Greenpeace for an Access documentary, which would be sort of the anatomy of a direct action. So you'd see the planning that would go into it, and they would be largely filming it themselves, because the program makers, we had to get legal advice on what position a program maker could take in that situation when it came to an action actually happening. And got sort of quite far. They were very keen to cooperate. I actually didn't get any Commissioner.
Where did you pitch it?
Here and there. Documentary.
Mainstream UK
mainstream
broadcasters?
UK broadcasters.
Okay.
But didn't get any interest in that idea, which I thought, hang on, there's some action, there's drama, there's potential sort of, police, there's, blue lights. I mean, it's got to be quite good, isn't it? I possibly was being a little naive. But anyway,
So why do you think they didn't go for it? Do they give you a reason?
I pitched it badly. I don't know. I mean, the subject matter wasn't. They didn't think it was going to be interesting to a wide enough group of people. I don't know. We didn't guarantee that it was going to be dramatic enough. I don't know. It's interesting.
What would you have needed to commission that? I mean, I can see issues with it, but
No, I think also you've got to appreciate that, when a pitch comes, I think pitching the perfect pitch, be it whether it be about puppies or whether it be about climate change, it's all about time, the time that it lands. And actually, it might just be that there was a situation about the time there. You kind of feel that actually, there's also 101 different programs that are being discussed at any one time. There's ideas that are in development which don't come to fruition. So it's always very difficult. You didn't pitch it to me, but and I don't commission documentaries, but. It sometimes, and I really mean this when I say it to companies, and I say it time and time again, is go back through your filing cabinets. Where are the ideas that are in the hopper? Where are the ones that you've had access to in the past that you didn't get away? Because it might just be that when you look at them again, dust them down, make them fresher, bring them back in again, because there's always an opportunity to open the conversation up.
thank you. We're getting very close to the end, so just quick comments, please. There's lady in pink and then the lady in the black t-shirt.
Hi.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually becoming rather excited at this session. And the reason is that I think we may have hit on something here, because I've been coming to these, as probably all of us had, and we've all felt the frustration that Lucy's expressed. And I think what's happened now in television commissioning is that there are fewer commissioners. We are all bombarding you with lots of ideas. It takes ages. It costs us all lots of money. And the fact is there are lots of good ideas out there. But I think the idea that actually you raised, Tom, is there a place for a magazine or some kind of commitment every week for a show, whatever you want to call it, in which there would be people who could commission program ideas, whether they are, here's a protest in London. I mean, I used to be deputy editor of Tomorrow's World. There are lots of possibilities in the magazine format. And maybe a half hour could be devoted to a film that's been made and that gets shown. But it could be something where there are commissioners whose job it is to sift out the best ideas. Could we not push, especially the BBC, maybe Channel 4, to take this up almost as a legal responsibility, so that we have a structure, and a bit like disability or diversity on screen.
I get the point.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm wondering if consideration of target audience could be a potential solution. I mean, obviously, certain broadcasters and programs have a demographic that they're trying to aim for, but if we look at what people have mentioned about short form and online content, if you look at transgenderism and how that became an issue and a subject that was talked about in a younger demographic because of online platforms and the videos that were made from that, I think if there are literally no climate change subjects floating the Vice and Dazed and those kind of platforms that get shared and shown between the younger people, and I think if that's tapped into, then that's where your trend comes from.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we have hit the 11:30 mark. Has anyone got any key things they want to sort of say from the panel just before we wind up?
One thing I haven't said is, and we've seen a couple of them, there are a couple in this room today, I think another challenge is finding some really eloquent voices. Talent is always in demand from commissioning editors, and if we can find those eloquent people who can put across the case for climate change most clearly, I think that'd be a really worthwhile exercise. And I suppose the other thing I would say is make it entertaining, borrow forms, don't just think about documentary forms, think about all forms of television into which climate change might be squeezed.
Just one very small point on that, just before we finish. Is there a danger that people sort of sniff it out? You know, they really think they're being hoodwinked, i.e., you're trying to smuggle a message in. I know my kids, for instance, are very, very perceptive about that. If they think someone's trying to smuggle a message in something else, it immediately goes down. They're sort of
I
being
don't know if the
duped.
programme's entertaining.
I think we've got to be better at signposting and actually saying what it is, and
Yeah.
actually don't try and smuggle. Somebody said smuggle earlier on, and I think it's something that we've got to get better at. But I think for me, the big thing I would say is don't self-edit too much. Bring your ideas to commissioning editors. Make sure that you've always got something brand new to say, because it always helps. If you can say that you've got a new fact, a new stat, a new piece of science, that is going to get listened to.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think the messages I took from that are, new, clever, human, preferably homegrown, and very intriguingly from Craig, don't be afraid of sometimes absolutely hitting it on the nose. If you can make it big enough, strong enough, that really cut through, don't always feel you have to dress it up in some other kind of clothing. Thank you very much indeed to the panel, and thank you very much for coming.